Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the latest installment of our Aquaculture webinar series sponsored by the United States Aquaculture Society and the National Aquaculture Association, with assistance from the Alabama Cooperative Extension System. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Alan Davis with us today, who is a distinguished nutritionist and professor with the Auburn University School of Fisheries, Aquaculture, and Aquatic Sciences. Dr. Davis has dedicated much of his research and teaching efforts towards improving technology and feeds for the culture of a variety of marine and freshwater aquatic species. On the marine front, his work includes diet and technology refinement for the culture of the Florida pompano, red drum, red snapper, white sea bass, California yellowtail, and Pacific white shrimp. On the freshwater side of things, he works primarily with catfish and tilapia. He is a recognized leader in the field of aquatic animal nutrition and has generously donated his time today to give us a brief overview. So thank you, Dr. Davis, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for the introduction. For those of you who do not know me, I'm with Auburn University. I'm their aquatic animal nutritionist, and I enjoy working closely with the industry. So hopefully we'll keep this overview of nutrition fairly practical and fairly applied, but we do need to talk a little bit about the basics. Now, as everybody knows, in order to have a successful operation, we really need to have high quality nutrition and we need to have good feed management. We'll probably do another section on feed management, one for fish and one for shrimp. But this is a critical component of the success of an industry. It's very important to have high quality feed management, high quality feeds. Quite often people ask, well, why is nutrition important? Why do I need to have a good understanding of it? Well, the quality of the feed that you're using is going to determine the growth rate of the animals. It's going to determine their health and disease resistance. If you use a poor quality feed, you're not going to get the best growth rates, and your animals are going to be subject to diseases. It also is the major cost of production. And this is what amazes me, is that somewhere between 40 and 70% of your variable costs, one of the largest variable costs you have on a farm, is the feed and the feed management. So you really need to have an understanding of the basics of nutrition and a very good handle on your feed management. It also, the quantity of feed that you put in a system and the nutrient content of that feed is going to determine the nutrient loading of the system. What does that mean? Well, how often do you have to exchange your water because of water quality? How much aeration do you need? How large a biofilter do you need? This is all dependent on the quality of the feed and the quantity that's going in there. And then, of course, the feed, the nutritional content of that feed also affects the final product quality. You're selling a high quality product onto the market, and you want to make sure that the quality of that product is the best it can be for the end consumer so you can get the best price. And the nutrients in the feed are transferred to the animal, which is the product that you are selling. So there's lots of reasons why we need to have a basic understanding of nutrition. So with few exceptions, nutritional requirements are very similar across species when we're talking about gross requirements. All animals, need energy. They need a source of protein or essential amino acids. They also need a source of lipids or essential fatty acids. They need vitamins and they need minerals. And if you look at the research that's been done, if you don't have a complete feed, it doesn't matter what level of intensity you're at, you're not getting the performance that your animals could get. Now, looking at diets and technologies, these are very much based on perspective. Quite often people ask me, what is the requirement for protein? Well, it just depends. There's lots of factors that affect the nutritional requirements, but there's also people's perspective. I come from a catfish tilapia industry, so I view the normal that low lipid diets, high carbohydrate content, moderate level of protein, they're usually soy or plant-based feed formulations. So I view that when you're outside those norms, you need to make sure that things are right. If you came from a trout background, and there's lots of nutritionists that come from a trout background, they are used to dealing with very high lipid diets, relatively low levels of carbohydrates, higher levels of protein, and animal-based feeds. And so when they go to formulate a feed, they tend to lean towards these components. I tend to lean to the other, but I understand that my perspective affects this. What we really need to do is be looking at what does the animal require, okay? So realize what you think the animal requires and what they actually require may be different just because of the perspective that you're looking at things. Another way to look at this, if you look at Asia and the Americas, in Asia, as a generality, they have higher levels of fish meal. They have higher levels of protein, about 5%. And so if you took a catfish feed in the US and a catfish feed, or a shrimp feed in the US and a shrimp feed in Asia, a lot of times they have about 5% difference in protein. And why? Well, I think this is because a lot of the nutritionists, a lot of the feed manufacturers are influenced by salmonid influence. So they're used to higher levels of protein. That's what they feel is the norm. Whereas in the Americas, we've always had relatively lower levels of fish meal. We've had lower protein diets. And because I think this is influenced more by the catfish and tilapia industry, and these species are very tolerant to those kind of diets. Now, which one is right? I don't know. It's kind of like Batman and Robin, or Batman and Superman. If you're arguing over which superhero is better, pretty funny when I first started using this, the movie came out where Batman and Superman actually had a fight and Batman won, right? So now we know Batman's stronger than Superman. Well, Batman brought Superman back to life the next movie. So it's just a matter of perspective. What do you think is better? Who do you think is better? All right. Neither of these are right. Neither of them are wrong. If you're in Asia and you're using a low fish meal diet, there's nothing wrong with that. Your neighbors may be using higher levels of fish meal. Well, that's costing them more money. Okay. So again, when we start thinking about nutrition, there's the nutritional requirements of the animal, and then there's also a perspective that we have. A lot of times people talk about feed conversions. So let's talk about feed efficiency and feed conversion just for a minute. And they say that, well, fish are a much better converter of feed. We have a feed conversion of, let's say, 1.3. Poultry has a feed conversion around 2.5. And of course, cows or ruminants are going to have much lower or higher feed conversion, lower feed efficiency, because they're dealing with very low quality ingredients, and they also have a rumen. But is this real? This is artificial. This is based on the nutrient density of the diet. We use somewhere around 35% on average as a protein content for our diets. If you look at poultry, we're only talking 18%, and we're talking ruminants, we're talking down at 11% or less, okay? So this is essentially a reflection of the nutrient density of the feed. Another way to look at this is I use feed conversion and dollars as an example. So I have 3 people. They all have $10. So Jane has 10 $1 bills. So she has a feed conversion of 10 to 1. Jack has 5 $2 bills. And yes, there are still $2 bills out there in circulation. I got one the other day. He has feed conversion of 5 to 1. Now Jill has 2 $5 bills. That's a feed conversion of 2 to 1. Do they have different levels of money? No, they all have the same amount of money. Does this mean Jane is less efficient? Well, yes, it takes her more bills to pay the bills, or more dollars to pay the bills. But is Jill poor because she only has 2 bills as compared to Jane, who has 10? Feed conversion is based on nutrient density of the feed. The more nutrient dense the feed, or the higher the level of protein, the lower the feed conversion is, assuming that you're feeding properly and you're within the tolerance ranges of the animals, okay? And then the other factor that's going to affect feed conversion is how much feed is wasted, all right? Do you have good feed management? So if you look at aquaculture again compared to other terrestrial animals, protein to protein conversion is actually much better than the nutritional quality of your feed. In terms of protein to protein conversion, we're pretty much equal to poultry or to pigs. Of course, with ruminants, we're going to be more efficient because of the rumen. But, as far as I'm concerned, we don't have any major advantage of converting protein to protein. All right, it's about 30% in terrestrials, aquatic animals. We do have some advantages of the amount of protein we produce per unit of energy consumed. And when I say energy consumed, amount of energy in that feed. Fish are much more efficient than terrestrial animals. This is primarily because they're suspended in the water column. They don't have to regulate temperature. Remember, you're sitting here listening to this. You're regulating your temperature, right? You're fighting gravity, whether or not you're standing up or sitting in a chair or running. You got to fight gravity, right? They don't. They're suspended in the water. And then there's less cost in nitrogen excretion compounds. But bottom line is, our main advantage in aquaculture as an agriculture producer of protein is because we can produce more protein per unit of energy needed. So let's start talking about energy. So we have proteins, right? That'd be your steak. Carbohydrates, that'd be rice, corn, wheat. We have our fats, that'd be, like your oils, your lipids. And those all can be converted through central metabolism to produce energy, okay? So energy, although we talk about it as a nutrient, it's really a property of other nutrients, okay? It's required to drive all chemical reactions, which includes tissue maintenance, voluntary activity, involuntary activity, and of course, lastly, it's going to drive growth. So if you look at a cascading tree, starting with at the top, what's in the feed? We may have some carbohydrates, proteins, or lipids, so some energy, and we'll call this gross energy because that's what would happen if you simply burned up the feed. Well, part of it is going to be digestible, and that's what we call digestible energy, and part of it's going to go out in the feces, so it's never even goes into the animal's circulation. Part of what goes into circulation, so the digestible energy, some of it also is going to be excreted. So for example, you could have glucose digested, absorbed, and then it's simply excreted, so it never contributes as an energy source. So when we get what goes to actual use by the animal, we call that our metabolizable energy, and that's going to come into things that have to be done, maintenance type things. And then there's going to be recovered energy, energy that's stored in tissues. And what I want to point out is the last two things on the list, sexual reproduction and then tissue development. So if we have animals that are going to reproduce, our energy goes into the gamete production, so production of eggs. So if you're producing animals for spawning, this is a good thing. If you're producing an animal for food fish and you actually want the protein, the fillet, well, anything that goes into gametes is energy and nutrients that are wasted, right? This is the reason we take tilapia and have all male tilapia sexually reverse their sex, or we genetically manipulate them, or maybe we do triploids in some cases. But bottom line is we want to have deposition into our tissues that we're going to be selling, okay? And if it's reproductive tissues, then that's going to come off first. If it's growth in terms of muscle tissue, that's going to come off last. We need to make sure our animals are not reproducing. Overall, realize that an animal is going to basically eat to meet their energy requirement. What we mean by that is they're going to meet all their basic needs in energy. They're going to take in all the nutrients, whether it's proteins, carbohydrates, or lipids, and convert them to energy for basal metabolism and for required nutrients, things that they have to do before they use them for other things. So if we look at our energy sources, as I said, we have carbohydrates. So as I said, this is going to be your corn, your wheat, your rice, sorghum. These are very inexpensive sources of energy. They're moderately well digested, but realize, just like when you go home and decide you're going to have rice for dinner, you don't go into a bag and simply take the rice out of the bag and eat it. You have to process it. You're going to cook it. You're going to put it in water and you're going to cook it. Well, feed processing does the same thing. When we go through extrusion processing or pelleting, we process those carbohydrates to make them more digestible. So the source of the carbohydrate as well as the processing are in effect the energy. We also have proteins, lots of protein sources out there, fish meal, animal proteins such as poultry meal, soybean meal from plants. Almost all proteins are highly digestible if they're properly processed, and they're going to be used for growth. Okay, now we want them used for growth. The problem is that if we don't have enough non-protein energy in the diet, they're going to use them as an energy source. All right. Lipids, highly digestible. The problem with lipids is there's an upper limit to how much lipid you can have in a diet. Just like you go home and you might take some butter and put it on a piece of bread and eat it. That's a little bit of lipids. That's good, but you wouldn't take that whole stick of butter and just eat it straight away because you have a tolerance to how much lipids you can take in. Okay, fish, shrimp, the same thing. There's limits to how much lipids we can have in a diet. Now, for some of our salmonids and our flatfish, it's very high. But this is a great energy source. It's highly digestible. Some of the saturated fats, it's lards, especially in our cold water species, these are going to be probably not as well digested. It's not because they're not really well digested, it's because it's more difficult to get them to be emulsified and then allow them to be digested. Other things that we're going to use is carbohydrates. And what I want you to realize is that a carbohydrate, so I've given you 3 examples on the right-hand side. The top one, cellulose, is glucose and glucose. The bottom one is glucose and glucose. Now, the top one, of course, we can't digest. The bottom one, we can. Amylose is fairly easily digested, okay? And the only difference is the bonding between them. So realize that the type of sugars that are used to make a carbohydrate and the bonding between those carbohydrates, as well as the branching, makes carbohydrates fairly complex. And so not all carbohydrates are digestible, and it takes a suitable suite of enzymes to digest those carbohydrates. Consequently, some carbohydrates, such as cellulose, are very difficult to digest. Others are very easy to digest. But those that are digestible are inexpensive and a great source of energy. So wheat, corn, sorghum, rice, examples of primary carbohydrates that we're going to use in the feeds. Now, there is no carbohydrate requirement. You don't have a carbohydrate requirement. Fish don't have a carbohydrate requirement. The problem is, if you take carbohydrates out of the diet, you can't pellet it. You can't process it. So we require carbohydrates in our feed formulations, not only because they spare protein being used as an energy source, but we require them for binding, for cohesion. So for example, in a sinking feed, you have to have a minimum of 10% carbohydrate to get the binding to produce a sinking feed. For an expanded feed, one that floats on the water, we need 20% in our feeds. So I'm giving you some examples just to show you some digestibility values. In this case, this is with shrimp. Here's another graph in terms of catfish. And with this, I want to point out that there's 2 things that affect digestibility of carbohydrates. Number 1 is the cook, as we talked about earlier. So you can see that the carbohydrate value is much higher when carbohydrates are cooked. The other thing I want to point out is that as you go from a low level of carbohydrate to a high level of carbohydrate, the digestibility of those carbohydrates actually goes down. So if you go from a high protein feed to a low protein feed, what happens? You bring in more carbohydrates. Well, you're also going to end up with less digestibility of those carbohydrates. Those carbohydrates then go into the system, and you're essentially carbon loading your system. So the lower the protein content of the feed within a range that the animal tolerates, we're going to have less digestibility of that energy source that you're paying for. And so it's oftentimes not as efficient as having a higher level of protein and a lower level of carbohydrates, because those carbohydrates are actually going to be digested better, and you're going to have less carbon loading of your system. Now, because of this desire to spare protein from different carbohydrates, you can see that we quite often talk about energy to protein ratios. And those energy to protein ratios are known for a lot of different species. I've given you some examples here with different species of shrimp. But basically what we want to do is make sure that there's plenty of non-protein energy in the diet so that the protein is spared for growth. Using protein as an energy source is extremely expensive. Aquatic animals do it very efficiently, but that means it's costing you more money and you're loading more nitrogen in the culture system. So here's an example, and I'm giving 2 different levels of protein here. So this is a 30% protein, and we've done this with both fish and shrimp. We've done this actually with a number of species. But here's a 30% protein diet, and here's a 40% protein diet. And these were formulated to be isoenergetic, so they have the exact same amount of energy in them. We then formulated 2 diets, again with 30 and 40% protein, but we formulated them to be on fixed energy to protein ratio. So you can see here the energy to protein ratio is fixed. And what typically happens in a practical diet is a low protein diet is going to have a high energy to protein ratio, or a low protein diet. And then a high protein diet is going to have a lower energy to protein ratio. And quite often what people say is that this affects the performance of the animals. What I want to show here is we fed all these diets on a protein to protein basis. So we adjusted the ration so they have the exact same amount of protein. So in this example, if you look at 30% protein and the 40% protein, you're going to feed 75% of the ration in the 40% protein as compared to the 30% protein, right? So if you take 0.75 times 40, that equals 30. But that gives us a lower level of energy that we fed in this example. And then when we come back over here, the energy to protein ratios are identical. So again, we feed the exact same amount of energy and the exact same amount of protein. If you look at the growth response of these animals, you would expect when you drop the level of protein that you would also decrease performance of the animals, yet the performance of the animals is identical across all these diets. So they have very different energy intakes, but they have equivalent level of protein. All right, and that's because protein is the limiting factor, it's not energy. When we look at feed conversion, of course, the 30% protein diet is going to have a poorer feed conversion than the 40% protein diet because we fed 25% less of that ration. So we only fed 75% of the quantity in the 40% protein diet as we did as in the 30% protein diet. So that's going to lead to a lower feed conversion. If you look at regression across protein levels and energy levels, you find that the correlation is to protein intake, not to energy intake. And as I said, we've done this with a number of species, and this is primarily because we're looking at relatively low protein diets. So the way I look at this is very simplified. When we're dealing with diets that are 40% protein or higher, it's possible that energy is limiting relative to protein. But if we're dealing with diets that are less than 40%, and this is just an arbitrary number that I don't know exactly, there's no science behind it. That's where I feel that level is based on my experience. If we have 40% or less, we probably have an excess of energy relative to protein. Now, if you're using really bad energy sources, you could be limiting on energy. But if you're using quality ingredients, more than likely, protein intake is going to be limiting and not energy intake. Now, if we go to the higher protein diets, 40% and higher, then energy quite often does become limiting. Okay. So the next thing we want to talk about is proteins. And proteins to me are the most important component that we have to learn about. Proteins are the most expensive component of the diet if you look at the overall cost. And to me, this is the thing that people don't understand, or they understand the poorest. So if you think about a protein, the way I visualize a protein is simply a string of beads, different colored beads representing different proteins. And if you take those beads, you can extend them. That's the series of amino acids. When you put them into a ball in your hand, they're folding on top to themselves. That's a complex protein, and that can be bound with other things. But basically, a protein is a series of about 20 different amino acids that are joined together, and they have very specific functions, okay? And if you look at or think about, how's a protein made, or how's a person made, or how's a fish made? Well, a fish is a transcription of the DNA to build all the building blocks that make something. So this is no different than you going home and taking out some plans to build a house or taking out some plans to build a bicycle. There's a very specific number of parts and types of parts that are needed to produce the product. Now, some of those parts are interchangeable, okay? Or maybe we can take one and modify it a little bit to make it fit for the other. Those would be our non-essential. Those are things that we can change out. Others, we can't. There's no way we can modify them. We got to have them. Those are essential amino acids. So we can break the amino acids into both essential and non-essential. The non-essential are amino acids that we can either synthesize or we can modify to produce another amino acid, whereas the essential amino acids we cannot synthesize. So in my little diagram, if you think of a bicycle or my box with two wheels, there's DNA code defines how this is built, and it basically needs an essential amino acid and two non-essential amino acids to build this protein. Well, if we decide that we want to have more protein in the diet, we can throw in some more non-essential amino acids. And that would raise the level of protein in the diet. It would no longer be a balanced protein, but it would still be a higher protein diet. But if we want to build our protein, we can only still build one of these units because we're limited by that essential amino acid, that square. So the rest of those amino acids, we can't do anything with them. They're essentially coming over. They're not being utilized. They're going to be broken down as energy. That means we're going to produce ammonia, and that means we're going to contribute to water quality problems. So if we have an imbalance, not only do we not have the best growth of our animals, but we also contribute to water quality problems. So another way to look at this is we've got about 10 or 11 essential amino acids. These are the ones that cannot be synthesized. Lysine, methionine, and phenylalanine are typically the most limiting in feed formulations, but we found out recently that in a number of our marine fish, the first limiting amino acid is taurine. Now, this is not included in protein, so taurine does not deposit in proteins. It is an amino acid, but it's not a component of proteins. It's used for a lot of different chemical compounds, but it is the first limiting amino acid in some of our marine species when we take out fish meal. So what we need is a balance of these amino acids. We need both essential amino acids and we need non-essential amino acids. So if you look at protein requirements, we have lots of information on protein requirements. You'll notice that a lot of these, that there's more than one response. And that's because the need for protein is, or the requirement for protein is dependent on other factors: digestibility, the quantity you feed, the size of the animal, the genetic potential for growth. Okay, so there's not one answer. Okay, but usually there's a range which animals will tolerate. So you can see here's a number of marine species, here's a number of freshwater species, and you can see even down at the catfish, I'll point that out. For the last 30 years, they've been arguing over, is it better to use 28 versus 32 for production diets? Both of them work. There's advantages and disadvantages to both. One of the reasons a 32% protein diet works better in a production system for catfish in at least Mississippi and Alabama, they're using multi-phase production systems. So really the 32 favors the growth rates of the smaller fish. It's not making much difference in terms of the growth rates of the larger fish. So what they do, and from year to year, they get better performance because of that 32% protein. The other reason the 32% often works better is because they're really not feeding as much as the fish needs. Consequently, having a more nutrient-dense diet, you get more nutrients into the animal. Consequently, you're going to get better performance. Another example, here we have tilapia, carp, and channel catfish, and this is actually what we'd like to talk about, is the essential amino acids. Now, we're not going to change talking about protein levels of feed, but it would actually be better if we talked about what is the limiting amino acid in my feed and what is the level that it is at. So for example, lysine or methionine, what level is it in the feed? The level of protein is really not that relevant. It's really what is my limiting amino acids, okay? We do have good numbers on requirements for numbers fish species. Don't have the best requirement data for some of our shrimp species, but we do have some good estimates of where they are. So what we're doing in terms of feed formulations, this is just a quick example. So here, if we have 100% of the requirement, so this being the requirement for methionine and cysteine, or the total sulfur amino acid requirement. If you look at different ingredients, so soybean meal, peanut meal, cottonseed meal, and fish meal, you find that their inexpensive ingredients are quite often low in essential amino acids. The more expensive ingredients that contain a lot of essential nutrients are going to go on the market for a higher price because they have more essential nutrients. What we'd like to do is make a feed that is not in excess. So if you look at, in this case, soybean meals actually has an excess for channel catfish. Or if we look at fish meal, it has a lot of excess. So if we were simply to use fish meal as a protein source, we'd be wasting a whole lot of amino acids because it's in excess of the requirement. If we were to use cottonseed meal, we wouldn't have nearly enough amino acids and we wouldn't get the growth. So what we do when we're formulating feeds is basically we want to get rid of the excesses and we want to fill in the holes to make for a better balanced amino acid profile. And that's what the nutritionist's job is to balance the amino acid profile so you can have not only a more cost-effective feed, but we also aren't wasting nutrients and causing problems there. So let's look at this another way. This is an example. We've done this with tilapia, we've done this with shrimp, we've done this with this example of red drum. And this is actually a very large fish. This is about 150 gram fish, and we actually took this all up to about 450 grams. But this is the first 6 weeks of growth, just to show the example. And across the bottom, you can see it's grams of protein per kilogram per day, or you can think about this as the quantity of feed that you give, or you can think about this, the quantity of protein in the feed, and you give them the same amount of feed. So this is intake of protein. But you can see just after 2 weeks, and this is a fish that's about 8 inches, 150 gram fish is a good sized fish. You can see that just in 2 weeks, you can see that there's a general response to the level of dietary protein intake. When you get to 4 weeks, you can see that there's a clear plateau now, and you go to 6 weeks, and we took this to 8 or 12 weeks, but that plateau doesn't change as you move through time. So what this shows is if you reduce too low level of protein, you're not going to get the growth that you could get. If you have an excess of protein, so right here we have way too much protein, we're not getting any more growth, okay? So all we're doing is we're wasting those nutrients. Those are nutrients in excess. Where we would like to be is right here where this turns. Ideally, we'd like to feed just the right amount so we get maximum growth and maximum efficiency, or maybe we back off a little bit so we make sure that we don't waste any nutrients. This is just a good example showing how quickly an animal responds to daily intake of protein. Same thing happens if you simply take out an individual amino acid. So this is some juveniles looking at dietary supplements to some diets. And just as an example, we have running right here that we're deficient in methionine. So you can see very quickly the animals fall off and stop growing. But then as soon as we supplemented the methionine back in, which is right here at the arrow, the animals start growing again, okay? So it's simply, if you have one amino acid that's low, that's gonna result in reduction in performance, okay? That's the reason we talk about this barrel model. You're limiting right here with lysine. If you fill that lysine hole, you're now limiting at lysine and methionine. If you were to fill that up, you're then threonine is going to be your next limiting amino acid. But basically, as you build back and get a better balance, you're going to get increased performance. Okay, so that's what we want to try and do with our proteins and amino acids: is have a good balance of essential and non-essential amino acids, and make sure that those essential amino acids are balanced as best as we can. Now, the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is lipids. And these are a dense source of energy. They're a source of essential fatty acids. So realize some lipids cannot be synthesized, and so they have to come through the diet. But that lipid source also carries a lot of fat-soluble compounds. So our vitamins, pigments. In the case of shrimp, it's very important that brings in cholesterol, okay? But it also adds to the texture. It adds to the flavor or attractability of the feed. And then when we're talking feed processing, the quantity of lipids and where they're coming from has an effect on our ability to produce the feed. It affects the processing of those feeds. So it's a critical component of our diets. We have some very good understanding and very good numbers on acceptability of lipids for a number of different species. In general, our marine fish are going to accept lipids higher than our freshwater fish, although there are many examples of exceptions to that. But in general, marine fish, somewhere between 8 and 16% of the diet. Now, our salmonids, trout, some of our sea bream, some of our flatfish, they're very tolerant of lipids, and you can go in excess of 20% of the diet. Mostly our freshwater fish were in the range of 5 to 12%. A lot of times when we get to high lipid diets in our freshwater species, the performance is not as good, especially in our shrimp, which I'll show you in a minute. Now, one of the things that we find is that in terms of marine fish, as well as some of our freshwater fish, but in general, essential fatty acids or highly unsaturated fatty acids are required by our marine species. We have to supply in the diet DHA, EPA, arachidonic acid, which are our highly unsaturated long-chain fatty acids. We also have to have some phospholipids in there, and this is an emulsifying agent, but it also a requirement for phospholipids. Marine shrimp, not quite as tolerant of lipids as other marine species. Anything above about 12% is going to produce reduced growth and a lot of performance problems. They too have a phospholipid requirement, but what's different from our fish species is that they require cholesterol. They cannot synthesize cholesterol, so they need somewhere between 0.1 and 0.15% of a cholesterol source in the diet, and that is assuming that you have a good emulsifying agent or phospholipids to help emulsifying that cholesterol. So if you look at fatty acid synthesis, now remember, I told you that almost all animals require linoleic and linolenic, okay? So what we can do is synthesize right here. We can make a 16 and 18 carbon fatty acid, but then we have our desaturases and our chain elongation can make this family of fatty acids, the N9s. But there's nothing within our metabolism that allows us to make the N6 or N3 series of fatty acids. Those have to come through the diet, all right? When those come through the diet, then a lot of animals can chain elongate and desaturate them to produce these highly unsaturated fatty acids that are required for a lot of functions. For example, your brain function. Hopefully your brain function is working right now very well. That's because you have appropriate levels of EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acid when you're a child. If they're not working so well, maybe you can blame it on your childhood. Anyways, we do need these essential fatty acids, but not all species can chain elongate and desaturate either fast enough or maybe they've lost the ability completely to meet requirements. And in general, this is in our marine species. So if you look at this for warm water species and cold water species actually, our warm water species somewhere between 6 and 8% dietary lipid is typical. Our marine species, we're usually talking 12 to 15%. But if you look at linoleic and linolenic, our freshwater species in general can chain elongating to EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acid. But in general, a lot of our marine species cannot, okay? So if we're dealing with marine species, we really have to make sure these are in the diet. If we're dealing with freshwater species, we may need them in the diet, but almost all species will benefit from having them in the diet. It's much easier to have something put through the diet as opposed to synthesizing it yourself, okay? So almost all nutrients, even though an animal can make them, if they come through the diet, it's more efficient. All right, the next nutrient we want to talk a little bit about is minerals. This is the inorganic component of the feed. It serves a wide variety of functions. So if you think about it, it's your hard tissues. So it's the bones, the scales, the exoskeleton, the teeth of an animal, right? But it's also a component of soft tissues. These are cofactors and activators of enzymes. They function osmoregulation, acid-base balance, membrane potential, so nervous impulse transmission, right? So minerals have a lot of different functions, both structurally and as activators or cofactors. There's a number of minerals that are required nutritionally, but most of them we don't have to worry about. There's only a few that are really need to worry about in terms of dietary supplements. And typically that's these. Now, phosphorus is very important because of cost as well as environmental. Magnesium, if you're in a freshwater system, there's usually very little magnesium in the water, so you're going to need magnesium supplemented. If you're in the marine system, there's lots of magnesium in the water. You actually have to excrete it, and so you don't really need a dietary requirement. So what one has to consider is that in aquatic animals, they're immersed in the water. So if there are minerals available, now with the exception of phosphorus, to my knowledge, phosphorus is not absorbed across any of the tissues for whatever reason. But our other minerals, such as magnesium, calcium, these can be absorbed across tissues. Consequently, they don't have to come through the feed, all right? So one of the things that we're not going to say is that there's a calcium requirement because almost all animals, it's very exceptional water if you have no calcium in your water, okay? So calcium, it can come from the feed, but it also can come from the water. Typically, There's no need to supplement specifically calcium. So again, these are the primary minerals that we need. As I said, phosphorus is the one that is the most important because it costs us a lot of money, but it's also environmental pollutant, and it's often regulated because of that. So remember that phosphorus is leading to eutrophication. So you can see this huge algae blooms right here. That's primarily driven by phosphorus loading, although nitrogen also contributes to that. Because it's environmental pollutant, we want to minimize the levels in our feed. It also costs us money. As a general rule, non-scaled fish, so they're going to have less hard tissues. They have a lower requirement for phosphorus. The level for available phosphorus is around 0.4. Scaly and bonefish around 0.6. Okay. Now realize that the availability of minerals depends on the source, and that really depends on the solubility. Now that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but in general, the solubility will be determining how available something is. So here's an example. We got a catfish, which has an acidic stomach. We have a carp that has a non-acidic stomach. And remember, if you take something that's water soluble, it doesn't matter if it goes in acid, in acidic water, or regular water. But if you take something that's not water soluble and you put it in an acidified water, it's going to become more soluble. So what we see, calcium phosphate monobasic, very water soluble, has very good bioavailability to almost all animals. But you go to calcium phosphorus dibasic, or even better, tribasic. This has very low water solubility. Consequently, in a catfish, you have reduced biological availability, but you still have about 60% availability for phosphorus because there's an acidic stomach. But if you go to, for example, a carp that does not have an acidic stomach, it's only going to have about 10% availability because of the lack of that acidic stomach. So realize animals with acidic stomachs are going to have more minerals available to them or have higher bioavailability of those minerals. If you look at shrimp, we have similar data. So here we have an example with shrimp, again, showing the bioavailability. Now, just to point out, this is an example of red drum looking at phosphorus requirement. And one of the interesting things with minerals is that they'll draw down mineral stores to sacrifice those stores to maintain growth. So in this example, we never saw a depression in growth, or not a major depression in growth for the red drum, even though they're extremely deficient in minerals. And if you look at the mineralization of bones and scales, which is here in this graph, as you can see going to the right, we have an increase in phosphorus. As you come up to the phosphorus requirement, which is right in about 0.7, 0.8% of the diet, you see that mineralization comes up and then it stabilizes. Okay, so what they are capable of doing for minerals is you're going to see that there's enzymatic or storage differences are going to be affected long before growth. Okay, so if you have a deficient diet, you may not see it in terms of growth, but the health or the enzyme activity of those animals may be impaired. As I mentioned earlier, we don't worry too much about calcium in terms of supplements, and actually what I find is that having excesses of calcium is actually hindering phosphorus availability. So this is an example of looking at different levels of calcium and different levels of phosphorus. But here, when we have very, very low levels of calcium, the basal amount of phosphorus, which is about 0.3, met the requirement. But as you came up in calcium content, you had to add more phosphorus in order to meet the requirement, probably because calcium and phosphate are rebinding together and becoming unavailable as the calcium level. So in my opinion, for aquatic animals, we want to keep the calcium to phosphorus ratio down. In terrestrial animals, it doesn't matter if you have an excess of calcium, but in aquatic animals, having excesses of calcium to me inhibits our phosphorus availability. So I try to minimize the level of calcium that's supplemented. I never supplement calcium as its sole source. Of course, if you're using calcium phosphate, you're going to be supplementing calcium, but you're really using it as a mechanism to bring in phosphorus. Okay, but try to keep that level below a 2-to-1 ratio of calcium to phosphorus. Now, quite often people ask me, I have natural productivity available to my animals. Consequently, I don't need a complete feed. Well, we've looked at this in several different species. This is an example with shrimp. We've looked at it in trace nutrients. We've looked at it in essential fatty acids. This is an example of phosphorus. But here we have an outdoor production system where there's natural productivity. We have a deficient diet, it's first diet, a diet that meets the requirement, and a diet that's replete in the requirement. And you can see that growth was reduced in the animals that had low levels of phosphorus in the diet and that weren't meeting the phosphorus requirement. And then this is common, in my opinion, whenever we're dealing, even if there's presence of natural productivity, that we need a complete diet to get the best performance of our animals. Now, there are some differences between physiology of animals. So if you look at a shrimp versus a vertebrate, so a fish, they have different uses of respiratory pigments. So in fish, we have hemoglobin. In shrimp, we have hemocyanin. In fish, it's iron-based. In shrimp, it's copper-based. And this is one of the big sources of sinks for those nutrients or requirements for those nutrients. So if you look at iron requirement in fish, it's quite high. Copper requirement in fish is relatively low. If we look at the iron requirement in shrimp, it's very low. Look at the copper requirement, it's quite high. So you'll see that, you know, nutrient requirements do change between species, and a lot of the times this is due to physiological requirements. There's differences in physiology between those animals. Now, we do want to mention chelated minerals, and chelates can be both good and bad, so I'm going to mention both. This simply is an agent that binds with a mineral. So we can have reduced bioavailability. So plant-based ingredients have phytate, which can be destroyed by phytase, but that phytate binds phosphorus. It binds some of our trace minerals. It'll actually bind some of our amino acids, but its job is to hold on to minerals. Its function in a seed is to hold those minerals until germination. Then phytase is produced, which breaks down the phytase. The minerals are released and they're available for the plant as it grows. So this is an example of something that will bind things. We can also have chelated minerals that are good, in which case we take an amino acid or a peptide and you attach a mineral to it. This is a great way to deliver minerals. Number one, the minerals don't react with other things. We have problems with, for example, iron reacting with vitamins and lipids, but it's not going to be reactive when it's chelated, and it's less water soluble. So it's not going to leach out of the feed, but the delivery is very good. It's quite often much better than it is with a inorganic source. There's lots of chelated minerals out there: copper, iron, potassium, manganese, selenium, and zinc, to name a few. So even though they're less soluble in water, they're still delivered very efficiently. Just to give you an example of a trace mineral premix, and just to point out that, you know, magnesium, you're going to cut that out if you're dealing with marine species. And then copper, you're going to raise that if you're dealing with a shrimp versus a fish. Quite often people use the same trace mineral premix and simply modify it for fish and for shrimp by supplementing with copper. If you have an excess of magnesium, it's not going to hurt anything. It's just costing you a little bit of money. Now, vitamin requirements, these are very well studied across a number of different species. Marine, freshwater, deficiencies are well established. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on vitamins. Just mention the fact that we have our fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K. These are very important, and we do know what the requirements are. Just as an example of a vitamin deficiency, vitamin A, enlargement of the eye, displacement of the lens, so very distinctive characteristics. Then we have our water-soluble vitamins, of course. We also have good information on these requirements. Just to point out one of them, ascorbic acid or vitamin C, used to be very common to have deficiencies because vitamin C in its native form is very unstable, and so it breaks down. Unfortunately, in shrimp, you do have black spermatophore, which can be caused by vitamin C deficiency, but for the most part, you don't have any clear deficiencies of vitamin C because the molting process is very stressful. So quite often in a vitamin C deficiency, they die during the molting process. In the case of fish, we see scoliosis and lordosis, curvature of the spine, shortening of the head. Again, these animals, if not taken care of, are going to pass away, but these are not going to kill the animal. Shortening of the gill opercula and things, they'd be less efficient, but we see them in aquaculture because we care for the animals. So here, a shortening of the head, you see the shortening of the gill opercula, and then the twisting of the gill. So there's some very characteristic signs for a lot of our vitamin deficiencies. So they're very well established. The last thing I want to just briefly talk about is other chemical agents. And aquaculture quite often gets a bad reputation for the use of chemicals, and you as farmers and researchers should use chemicals appropriately. I have no problem using therapeutic agents after diagnosis and when they're used properly. Appropriate withdrawal period, etc. The problem is a lot of people don't use them appropriately, and there's lots of problems with antibiotics not being used properly or chemicals not being used properly. And then there's also, you have some things that are, I don't understand. They're market restrictions or perceptions by people. I'm not sure what the reasons. Maybe they're trying to keep people out of a market. But an example is ethoxyquin is not allowed in the feed in Japan, yet in Japan, ethoxyquin is used as an antioxidant in human foods. So some things don't always make sense, but you have to play by the rules. If you're going to a specific market, you need to understand what that market is and what their requirements and restrictions are. Because of the limits on use of antibiotics and the fact that you really need to use them appropriately, but in reality, we'd like to never use antibiotics. There's a lot of alternative therapies that are out there. Some of these are good, some of these are bad. Just to point out where some of these come from, for example, a lot of people are looking at different bacterial strains to prevent diseases, so prebiotics and probiotics. And so just as a general overview, if you're looking at probiotic, you're taking samples from, let's say, the soil, or maybe you're taking from fish. You're going through some sort of screening to find which bacterial will inhibit specific pathogens. And what you find is that there's a lot of different mechanisms for this. So it may be that they produce a chemical, it may be that they exclude, it may be that they take up a site. There's lots of ways that these function. They're not all the same. But you're looking for something that's going to inhibit a specific pathogen, and then you're going to potentially use that in the feed as a mechanism to reduce the occurrences of the disease. These are very popular. In my experience, they do work under laboratory conditions, but they're not necessarily a silver bullet. There's lots of examples of where they do work in commercial conditions, but they're not going to solve all problems. So you need to use them at an appropriate time in an appropriate way also, just like you would any other supplement. So to me, take-home message here is that sound nutrition will produce the best results. If somebody is promising you magic, it probably is that. It is magic. If it's too good to believe, maybe you shouldn't be believing it. There's lots of things out there that are what I'll call snake oil, or in this case, we have in Asia a lot of drinks that have lots of interesting things in them. So to me, if you're going to obtain maximum use of feeds, you need to remember that they need to be nutritious. That means they're formulated to provide the required nutrients, they avoid nutrient imbalances, adequate energy for metabolism, and digestible. Using highly digestible ingredients, although they may cost you more money, is going to give you better efficiencies, and in the long run, that costs you less money. They also have to be properly processed. Remember, you can have the best recipe to make a cake, but when you put it in the oven and you burn it, it doesn't turn out properly. So we need to properly process it. We need to make sure these feeds are stable for both water, funguses, oxidation, and of course, it has to be palatable. It has to be this appropriate size, shape, texture. And then, most importantly, it has to be properly applied. And of course, from an economic standpoint, it has to be cost effective. I very much appreciate you taking time to listen to me, and I would be happy to answer questions via email if you'd like. Here's my contact information. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Alan, and we appreciate your time today and all the great information. And don't forget, folks, that this information and many more educational webinars and videos are available on the U.S. Aquaculture Society webpage and YouTube channel, the National Aquaculture Association webpage and YouTube channel, and the Aquaculture Education and More YouTube channel, curated by David Klein.